They sent it in a padded box with a typed chain of custody form folded like a confession. My name was on the header because of course it was. When the courier buzzed, the lab smelled like solvents and stale coffee. The hum of the centrifuge and the low, bureaucratic glow of my monitors were the only witnesses I trusted. I opened the box at my bench with hands that didn't feel like mine. A garment. A custom-piece soft cream silk, hand-stitched collar, the sort of thing I'd bought for Claire 3 birthdays ago because she had once told me, laughing over cheap wine, that the world felt harsher than it should and that beautiful things were a small rebellion. I remembered the shop. A narrow space behind an alley, a seamstress with needle-scarred fingers who wrapped the finished fabric in acid-free paper and looked me in the eye the way people look at one another when they keep an important secret. Now the paper curled under the fluorescent light. The tag had been torn. Someone had packaged my gift and sent it back into my life as a case file. "George, it's marked evidence." The lab manager's voice was polite, the way people are polite when they pretend not to be watching a private life unspool. She kept her distance, a professional nod that said, "We've seen everything." I put the garment on the bench between 2 calibration weights like an altar offering. The scent, faint perfume, coffee grounds, something metallic, hung above it and lodged in my throat. I read the paperwork twice. The client was anonymous. The referral came through channels that meant money and discretion. The notes: possible adultery, garments found in vehicle, request analysis. My world, which had been comfortably predictable in its numbing routines, fractured in a split second. For 10 years I had spent my days advising the wealthy and careful, teaching them to read shadows in DNA traces, to parse a smear of lipstick like a paragraph in someone else's life. I had built a career on translating small betrayals into incontrovertible facts for people who could afford truth when it was ugly. I never thought the microscope would point back at me. Claire came home that night humming. She kissed me like nothing had changed, slow, a hand at the nape of my neck, her cheek warm and trusting against mine. She held a paper bag of groceries and a novel she'd started and kept dog-eared. The scene was domestic, nothing cinematic, which made it worse. I had always loved the ordinariness of her. Ordinary things can be weapons or sanctuaries. The difference is the telling. "Did you have a long day?" she asked, hanging her keys on the hook we never used for anything other than habit. Her voice had that soft edge that made me feel like a man who had once been known and still might be. "Long," I said. I wanted to ask her 100 questions that would have been grotesque and intimate, like animals sniffing the air for danger. Instead, I pressed my thumb to the seam of the sleeve, a gesture rehearsed for professional reasons and suddenly personal, and the silk answered with a warmth that was not hers. We cooked then, together and mechanical, the way couples do to prove continuity. She told me about a stupid meeting. I told her about a sensor that had finally calibrated. We ate at the counter. She laughed at a joke of mine. There is a cruelty in such laughter when you know what comes after. That night, I stood in the dark of the lab and let the scope of what I had found settle like frost. I thought about the thousands of cases I had closed, the ruined reputations, the people who had begged me to make something incontrovertible out of a smear, a thread. I remembered a man who had dissolved into tears when I told him the evidence was damning. I had always been the interpreter, never the participant. Now the interpreter's pen trembled. Flashbacks arrived in the clinical clarity of a case file. I saw Claire in the alleyway shop, holding that garment to her chest and frowning in that way she does when she is making a bargain with both caution and desire. I heard the seamstress tell me, "She likes things that seem simple but are never just simple." I saw our wedding photos, the awkward toast I had made about trust being a living thing. I saw nights where her shoulder had been my harbor, applause for small mercies. When the denial failed, not dramatic, not cinematic, just tired, the floor dropped out of me. I called the courier who had dropped the evidence and asked, too casually, where such things came from. I cross-checked notes in my head like a man paging through a diary for a single incriminating line. Professionally, I knew the avenues. Legally and ethically, I had boundaries. Personally, I had a furnace. For 3 days, I worked like a man possessed and like a man at work. I opened files, reading other people's pain to numb my own. I sat through meetings and smiled my professional smile and told clients that we would help them find the truth. At night, I replayed our conversations with the forensic precision I applied to stains and fibers. There were patterns, Little absences in her calendar. The way her phone lit up and then was put down too quickly. But patterns are not proof. They are only a prologue. In the quiet, I let my rage calcify into a cold, meticulous resolve. Anger is a heat that burns everything. Calculation is a cool hand that breaks bones without trembling. I had a trade built on evidence and timing. Justice, or vengeance masquerading as justice, required more than fury. It required patience. I did not shout, did not demand explanations at the kitchen table. Instead, I asked Claire about minor things, like the name of a mutual acquaintance who had been in town. She answered, smooth as glass. In that glass, I saw the reflection of the man I had been. Trusting, slow, a man who believed stories until they were proven false. I hated him for a while. I hungered to return to him as a better man, but the hunger transformed. "You look tired," she said one evening, concern knitting her brow. "I'm fine," I lied. It was the simplest thing I could do. Lies cushion lies. They keep the world from collapsing all at once. I began to assemble a plan in my head the way I assemble a case. Not the how, not the instructions a novice could follow, but the architecture. I considered the moral ledger, what I had given, what I had been denied. I thought about the power of truth when it appears at the right moment in the right place. I thought about spectacle, about the corrosive force of revelation. I thought about ruin and restraint in equal measures. There were nights when I fantasized about theatrical exposures, bright lights, a public confession, a crowd's collective intake of breath. But the theater is cheap. Real impact is quieter and legal. Real ruin is not a crying scene on a viral clip, but a collapse measured by audited ledgers, lost clients, reputations that evaporate like morning fog. I knew how to push those levers. I knew how to make an affair feel not just immoral, but unsustainable for those who prided themselves on appearances and power. Yet even as my mind drew diagrams of cause and effect, a part of me, a stubborn, animal part that had loved Claire before I ever learned the contours of forensic ethics, whispered forgiveness. Not the saccharine kind. A practical, peculiar forgiveness that asked whether dismantling someone's life would rebuild mine. I had watched the wreckage that followed my work on other people's lives. I had not always been proud of the outcomes my findings produced. To break someone, to engineer their downfall, is to take on the role of judge and jury. Would I become what I despised? One memory kept coming back with the persistence of a rhythm. Claire on the balcony the winter we moved in, the city a scatter of lights below, saying softly, "Promise me you'll never make yourself small for me." I had laughed and kissed her then and promised not to. The promise had been made to a man who had not yet been confronted with his own humiliation. On the fourth day, a colleague dropped a file into my inbox with a casualness that felt criminal. "For you," she said. "You should see this." The file contained a receipt, a timestamp, and a photo. A blurred snapshot of a man and a woman leaning close in a cafe, bodies angled as if in conversation, but close enough for a whisper. The woman wore something cream that caught the light like a tide. My stomach sank in a way that made me dizzy. That night I held the fabric again, letting my thumb trace the invisible path of a seam. I thought about how small betrayals begin and how they end. Not always in violence, sometimes in paperwork. I imagined the hours of work ahead, the discovery, the slow turning of levers, the gathering of evidence in ways that would stand in court and in the court of public opinion. I imagined the humiliation of those who had loved themselves as irreproachable. I imagined the quiet, precise erosion of their certainties. And then, like a bell tolling for both of us, I realized this. The plan would not be merely punitive. It would be a reclamation. I would not seek to maim for the sake of cruelty. I would demand restitution for a life deferred, for promotions refused because I took the nights to rock a feverish child, for art supplies unbought because she wanted us to save, for the way my voice had been smaller in meetings while hers had been polished for the room. I told myself I would remain within the pale of law and procedure, that I would use what I knew to assemble undeniable truths. But the line between exposing and destroying is thin. I felt its edges like a blade. There was a moment, an almost tender one, where I pictured telling her everything and watching the shock wash over her like clean water. But love, I had learned, does not always survive illumination. Sometimes truth is a mirror we cannot look into for long. "George," she said one morning, finding me at the sink with the light behind my shoulders like a halo I did not deserve. She reached for my hand. I let her. Her palm was warm. "You're quiet lately." I wanted to tell her the whole thing, the box, the lab, the receipt, the photograph. I wanted to say I have everything. Instead, I said, "Work's been heavy." She smiled, relieved, and kissed me in that way that says, "Not yet, not now." The moment was an offering and a provocation. That night I began to write, not a manual, but a ledger: names, times, reputations, possible outcomes. Each line was a choice. Each choice would shape not only their lives but mine. I could orchestrate a public exposure that would humiliate. I could push for evidence to be examined in ways that would bring regulatory scrutiny. I could, with the help of legal counsel and industry contacts, apply pressure where it would hurt most. But I could not describe the methods in detail. Some powers should remain anonymous and dangerous only in imagination, not in instruction. Instead, I rehearsed the moral calculus: revenge for betrayal, justice for myself, or the more difficult road of forgiveness. I remembered that what we do for others sometimes becomes what we are. I had pulled threads from other people's lives and watched entire wardrobes unravel. I knew the warmth of victory could be counterfeit when bought with another's ruin. In the dark of my study, I held Claire's gift and felt both the wound and the instrument of its discovery. The silk was soft beneath my fingers, an absurdly intimate thing to become the axis of a life's unmaking. I thought of the seamstress, who had sewed the garment with songs on her breath and a child's tuition in mind. I thought of all the small economies that would ripple outward, of an affair as a stone cast into still water and the waves reaching lives I'd never touched. "One step at a time," I whispered to myself, the mantra of a man who has learned patience from microscopes and from grief. I drew a line on my pad and crossed it into the first column: evidence. The second, exposure. The third, consequences. The fourth, compensation. Each column was a promise I had to keep to myself. The lab is a cathedral to patience. Light moves across the benches in slow, indolent arcs. Instruments hum like prayers. When I set Claire's garment on the bench again, under a softer lamp this time, it seemed less an object and more a map. Threads that could be read, seams that hinted at touch, the faint trace of another life woven into the fiber. I had been trained to see stories in things. Now every fiber told me a line I did not want to read. I told myself I would move carefully, that I would behave like the professional I had always been. There are rules, legal, ethical, procedural, and I had spent my career inside their margins. But procedures can be used as scaffolding for darker designs. The difference is intention. I told my manager I needed extra time with a client sample, and she nodded, the way people nod when they give a colleague the privacy of suspicion. "You'll take it slow," she said, and there was more than concern in her voice. "Whatever you do, don't let this become personal." Her words landed like rain on stone. Of course it would become personal. The question was what shape that personhood would take. The man who collapses in a heap and begs for the world to stay soft, or the man who arranges his grief into a drill and carves a path. First, the phone. I spent nights in the forensics lab not because I loved the machines, but because they refused to betray me with gossip. We have methods to coax dead things back into speech, devices that remember, caches that refuse to be silent, and there are legal ways to ask for that memory. I did not, and would not, fashion a backdoor myself. For all my cold imaginings, there are limits to what I will become. So I drafted a careful request. A chain of custody that would look utterly ordinary in court. A petition to examine the device associated with the garment's last known location. I leaned on the relationships I had cultivated with lawyers and private investigators with reputations for discretion. One of them, a woman named Mara with a laugh like a locked door, met me at dusk in a cafe that smelled of cardamom and old wood. "You want me to do what exactly?" she asked, stirring sugar without looking at me. "Recover deleted messages. Forensically, legally," I said. The words tasted like metal. Mara's eyes were steady. "We can get data back, we can get timestamps, but why the garment? Why are you so careful?" "I need plausible chain," I said. It was the truth and not the truth, a professional justification and an emotional confession rolled into one. I need proof that will stand up. She pushed the cup toward me. Proof ruins people, she said, and for the first time in weeks she struck a note of pity. You sure that's what you want? The question echoed in the empty places of me. There was a memory attached to it. Claire asleep on the couch after a long shift, a coffee ring on the magazine, her hand finding mine in the dark and holding on like an anchor. I imagined those soft fingers now offering themselves to a stranger. My throat closed. We moved with the slow, respectful cadence that characterizes the work. Requests filed, devices handled with latex and blue tape, every step an attempt to preserve truth against decay. I watched as a specialist coaxed fragments of deleted threads of text from a phone's refuse. The recovered messages came like bones from silt, incomplete, jagged, more accusing for their gaps than for their words. The first cache was clinical, perfunctory, times, small arrangements. The second cache landed like a physical blow. He's here. I can't tonight. I have to keep it quiet. Meet at the old gallery after closing. Don't tell him about the business trip. Reading those lines, the world brightened in a way that made me nauseous. The rhythms were intimate, inside jokes, shorthand, the kind of language lovers invent to keep themselves a private country inside public life. The deleted messages were not merely evidence. They were a record of a parallel life, a place where my wife's laughter lived in phrases that were not meant for me. I slept in the lab twice that week, curled on the examination chair with a blanket that smelled faintly of solvents. The city continued, ambulances, dinner deliveries, the indifferent sweep of streetlights on rain. But inside me, the recovered texts etched a new architecture. They were coordinates. The names were there, a kernel of addresses, a suggesting of times. Nothing about them instructed harm, only revelation. But revelation, I knew too well, can be a kind of violence. At home, Claire moved through our rooms like an actress in a play she still hoped had not been noticed. She left the television on at an absurd volume sometimes, a tactic I recognized from others, noise to fill absence. We had conversations that measured not the content but the silences between sentences. Once, she leaned against the counter and said, "You've been different lately. Are you okay?" "Fine," I answered, the single syllable lie as smooth as silk. She shrugged and returned to her novel. As she slept that night, I found myself tracing the outline of her face in the dark, the slope of her cheek, the ridge of her nose, and asking myself whether love could be an act of possession or an act of liberation. I wasn't sure which version of love I had been practicing. I used the evidence in stages. Small, controlled revelations designed to do more than wound, to unsettle, to fracture the foundation they had been building together. I arranged for subtle threads to be pulled, a receipt quietly mentioned to a mutual friend, a corroborating witness that placed them together at odd hours, a photograph timed to be found rather than shown. I tasted each escalation like a man sampling a dangerous dish, spicy, addictive, with an aftertaste that settled deep. But the deeper machinery was legal and structural. The recovered messages let me build a case that looked less like gossip and more like liability. I consulted with attorneys who specialized in corporate law and personal ruin, experts in how a private indiscretion could bloom into a public downfall for those who traded on their reputations. We drafted a timeline, not out of malice, but out of an almost painful need for completeness. Evidence is merciless but fair. It gives everyone a chance to confront truth. At a small dinner with a friend, an old colleague who had once warned me not to let work become the lens for every relationship, I found myself confessing, not the specifics, but the weather of my soul. "It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff," I told him, stirring my coffee until the spoon rang. "And I keep thinking, if I step back, what do I keep? If I step forward, what do I become?" He listened without interrupting, his face lit by the low lamp. "Revenge," he said finally, "is a shape that fills whatever emptiness you offer it. It will answer you, but it won't repair what broke." That was the fear gnawing at me at odd hours. I wasn't blind to the fact that my profession had sometimes been a scalpel. I had watched people recoil at the sight of their own secrets. The difference here was that the scalpel had my name on the handle. Could I wield it cleanly, or would it blood both of us? I pictured the final scene I wanted. Not a tawdry viral spectacle, but a slow unmaking, careers retracted, clients informed, the lover's hand forced into public accountability. Yet the more I constructed that architecture, the more I saw the faces of collateral damage. The seamstress whose livelihood depended on discreet customers, the lovers' families who would be dragged into the light. I found myself shuttling between righteous anger and a tenderness that surprised me. There were nights when I considered simply walking away, folding the garment into its paper, and letting it become only memory. There were other nights when my hands shook with the precision of someone building an instrument of fate. On the 7th night, the messages supplied a new jewel, a plan for a meeting at a charity gala where influential people would be present, where the lover chairing a committee would be in his element, and where, if exposed, the fall would be most spectacular. I felt the old itch, the appetitive thrill that comes when your professional mind sees leverage. It sang through me like a siren. I sat in the dark, the recovered messages open on the lab terminal, and allowed myself a small, awful imagining. A microphone catching a whispered confession, a boardroom hearing that began with a text message read aloud. The scenarios were cinematic, and I was both the director and the audience. But the tagline that had haunted me since Chapter 1 returned with a louder voice. What will you be when the dust settles? Will you have reclaimed your life or traded it? I placed the garment back in its box with the same tenderness I might reserve for a relic. My fingers lingered on the paper, on the stain I had noted the first day. There was a tenderness in me still that I did not expect, a memory of winters and small kindnesses that had nothing to do with betrayal. Perhaps that tenderness was naive. Perhaps it was the last real thing left in me. I slept that night in the spare bedroom, away from Claire's soft, indignant breathing. In my pocket, my phone held the recovered messages like a living thing. I woke at 3 in the morning and stared at the ceiling until the sky outside paled with the earliest light. The choice had moved from theoretical to inevitable. Revenge, I told myself, could be precise and surgical. It could be a ledger of harm that left no question of cause and effect. Or I could make a different choice, a difficult, stubborn forgiveness that would cost me the easiest gratification. Morning came. I dressed slowly, like a man preparing for a ritual. On the bench where the garment had lain, I chalked a single line in my notebook. Step 1, confirm. Step 2, decide. For the first time since the evidence arrived, I felt the weight of a hinge, the simple mechanical thing that determines whether a door opens or shuts. I understood then that the rest of the story would be measured in the small choices that follow one another like beats in a heart. There is a peculiar intimacy to watching people you once loved move through their lives as if nothing has happened. They are actors on a stage you know the exits to, and you, behind the curtain, can see the seams. For days my life narrowed to a single axis, timing. Timing makes a revelation devastating or forgettable. Timing turns a truth into a spectacle or buries it as gossip. I began to imagine the sequence of moments the way I used to imagine experiments. Controls, variables, a predictable outcome if everything was executed with care. But between each calculated move lived consequence, and consequence had the peculiar habit of leaping beyond the neat boxes I drew. Claire was luminous at the gala. She moved through the room in a dress that caught the low lights like glass, smiling in that way that made people assume she was kind because she could be graceful. Her laugh landed 3 tables away before she did. Beside her was the man I had learned to identify in late-night messages and blurred receipts, Julian, precise in a tux, charismatic in the way successful men are when they expect nothing to challenge the architecture of their lives. He shook hands, traded compliments that meant business, and for a few hours the world did not know we were standing on a precipice. I watched from the mezzanine with a drink I did not taste. The plan, not an instruction manual but a choreography of pressure, relied on other hands as much as mine. I had not become a lone avenger. I had become a conductor, and the orchestra was composed of lawyers who loved precedent, friends who hated deceit, and a journalist who smelled a scandal like blood. They were professionals with their own moral rubrics. Some were more merciless than I'd imagined. That both comforted and terrified me. From above, Claire looked like a comet. Memory tugged. The first time she had worn a dress that made her feel brave, the way she had spun in front of me with the reckless, private joy of someone who believed she was allowed small rebellions. We had promised each other those rebellions. Promises, I thought, are a form of evidence too, proof of an intention that once existed. I did not want to ruin her in the way of a cartoon villain. I wanted the exposure to be surgical, reputations bruised where they mattered, financial consequences that tasted like deterrent, public humiliation that matched the intimacy of the betrayal. I had spent enough of my life seeing the ruin of others to know that collapse is a mess. Collateral damage is never neat. Still, the scaffolding of my plan began to fold outward. At 10 o'clock, Julian gave a speech. He spoke of community and stewardship, his voice polished by years of practice. Cameras panned and captured the bank of smiles. Somewhere between his third anecdote and a joke that landed too easily, an assistant, one I had nudged with a well-placed question weeks before, approached him with a tablet and looked at him with that small, urgent expression people use when they carry news that must be swallowed. I watched the set of his jaw change. He smiled on the outside. Inside, something like a lurched breath. I didn't push a button or shout his name. My role was smaller, and I told myself, cleaner, to allow truth to gather the momentum it deserved. The assistant's face said what the crowd would later read as confusion. Julian excused himself with an easy phrase that disguised his loss of equilibrium, and Claire watched him go, her hand unconsciously finding a place on his sleeve like a prospector seeking the familiar in the dark. Later, in the curtained privacy of a reception room, Julian stood with the tablet in his palm. The relief he felt reading a message that had been arranged to arrive at exactly that moment, that flash of certainty that what he had been keeping secret would continue to be hidden, was stolen from him without spectacle. He read. He paled. He muttered a name I had heard in whispers. The room closed around him and the assistant. The timeline I had helped assemble folded into a new shape. It was not the thunder I had built in my head. It was quieter, meaner, and more effective. On the ride home, I watched Claire's face in the rearview mirror, not the face of a woman who had discovered truth so much as the face of someone realizing the ground had shifted beneath her feet, and she had no map. She gripped Julian's hand with an intensity that felt like apology and defiance at once. I wanted to tell her then, to throw open the portfolio I had kept at my side, and see the look on her face. Instead, I folded myself into the passenger seat with the stillness of a man who had learned to wait. The days that followed were not cinematic fireworks, but quiet, insistent erosion. A friend of mine in corporate compliance put a discreet call into a client who had recently engaged Julian's firm. Suddenly, 2 board members who had previously admired him began to ask detailed questions about his recent absences. An old reporter began to make polite inquiries that wore at reputations the same way autumn wind wears at leaves until the branches show. A legal letter, phrased in civil rather than incendiary language, landed on a desk with a hint of inevitability that made executives shuffle. Revenge, I discovered, favors institutions more than dramatics. Institutions collect facts and translate them into consequences. Where once I had romanticized the public humiliation, the shouted confession, the viral clip, I found that this was the play of amateurs. The professionals use audits, notices, and reputational erosion. They are less satisfying in the moment and more devastating in the aftermath. There were small mercies. I watched Claire at a coffee shop, fingers wrapped around a cup, staring at a screen gaunt with fatigue. She tried to make a joke when our eyes met, and for a second the woman who had once been mine flickered through. The same woman who had pressed lip stain into the cuff of my shirt the night we fought about money. She was still capable of tenderness. She was still human. It hurt me to see how much of a person could be dismantled by the consequences I had set into motion. And yet the machinery kept running. Julian's clients shifted him to emergency leave, a phrase that sounded mild but carried teeth. Internal investigations, those indifferent beasts that reduce complex human behavior into boxes and checkmarks, began to unspool. Friends I had once trusted suggested I consider stepping away, that the moral cost might be greater than the satisfaction. People will get hurt, Myra said one night, her voice low on the phone. Not just them, people who don't even know why their lives will change. Collateral, I muttered. The word was sterile and terrible. You're not the first to think you can control the shape of ruin, she said. The thing you have to answer for is whether you can live with the ripples. I thought of the seamstress with needle-scarred fingers. I thought of nights when Claire had taken my hand in public and made our marriage look like a shelter. I thought of the child we might have had, of a life that was deferred by the choices we made, not only hers but mine, in the slow, small compromises of years. The ledger in my head grew with entries that were not monetary, apologies not offered, birthdays missed, the quiet humiliation of being the one who waited. There were nights when I imagined a different route. I pictured myself walking into our kitchen, explaining everything, offering evidence and apology in equal measure, and watching Claire decide how to proceed. That image felt like something a less bitter man might choose. It felt, in its own way, noble and insufficient. Forgiveness, I realized in these reveries, would not be a return to the old life. It would be an acceptance of the truth and the willingness to build anew. Which, perversely, might be harder than revenge. My friends began to see the toll. Someone sent me a message. "Are you eating?" Another called to remind me to sleep. I laughed once, a short, humorless sound, and told them I was fine. Fine was a word people use when they are not. Fine is a fabric stretched over an ache. One morning, a woman from Julian's firm reached out to me with a question about a procedural detail. She did not know me from Eve, only that I was in the periphery of a storm she was walking into. Her voice trembled not with fear, but with a professional dread I recognized. "We didn't mean for it to be like this," she said, and the words made my stomach roll. "No," I said, "no one ever does." At the edge of everything, the public inquiries, the cold calls from long-time clients, the quiet phone messages from people I thought I could trust, a quieter decision waited like a patient animal. I had orchestrated the collapse I imagined, and it was unfolding with a terrible, elegant inevitability. In the midst of it, Claire called me one night, her voice fragmented. "George," she said, we need to talk." I could have answered in a dozen ways. I could have let the next move be mine and watched the final scenes I had scripted fall into place. Or I could choose something else, slower, more dangerous in another way. "Come over," I said. The words surprised me. They surprised her. They surprised the man I had trained to be certain. When she arrived, the air between us was heavy with all the things we had not said. There was no grand accusation from me, no theatrical confession of the steps I had taken. There was only the quiet of two people who had once believed themselves unbreakable. "Why?" she asked finally, voice small like an animal caught in the rain. "Because I need to know who you are now," I said, "and because I need to know who I am after this." She sat across from me, and we traded truths that were both confessions and barring of raw edges. Her explanations were messy, human. They were not excuses, but narratives that held pieces of a life I'd been absent from. She cried in bursts that sounded like tabulated data, stop and start, calculated and wholly uncalculated. And as she spoke, the great question, the hinge I had felt for weeks, opened wider. The next chapters would not be about the mechanics of ruin. They would be about the thing that followed, whether I could hold both the evidence and the tenderness, whether revenge could coexist with mercy, whether a life could be reclaimed, or whether the reclamation would demand ruin. When she left that night, the world outside smelled of rain and exhaust. I stood on the landing and watched her walk away, and for the first time since the evidence arrived, I did not feel all-powerful or vengeful. I felt like a man who had finally realized the cost of his own next move. The orchestration had worked. The engines I set in motion were grinding and effective, but the aftermath, the human wreckage and the possibility of repair, had made the path forward narrower and more luminous than I had anticipated. Some reckonings arrive with a bell. Others arrive with the slow, bureaucratic rasp of a file being stamped and slid across a desk. Ours arrived in both guises, a headline that smelled of bleach and lemon, and a different sound, the soft, grinding noise of compliance files being opened in offices that had once whispered our names with admiration. The morning the first article broke, I woke before dawn. Rain had smudged the city into watercolor, and the sky wore the bruised color of a bruise that's still new. I brewed coffee I couldn't drink and sat at my kitchen table with the garment folded like a ghost beside me. Memory is an odd contraption. It will hand you a moment from years ago as if it were dialogue you can replay. I saw Claire, young, furious with the world, arranging costumes for a play she loved, and I felt the ache of a life that had not yet been negotiated by compromise and consequence. "You okay?" she asked from the doorway, the words small as a test. "Yes," I said. The word was brittle. The phone buzzed. The headline glared. Leading consultant's wife linked to high-profile affair Julian under investigation. The piece was careful enough for the first pass. Names withheld, insinuations framed as fact. But where journalism meets curiosity, it often becomes spectacle. Within a day, a second outlet followed, and then a third. Tweets stacked like papers in a windstorm. The private life we had hidden under thin domestic rituals was now a public thing, sniffed and chewed. When the calls started, they were surgical. A partner at my firm asked to meet. 2 long-term clients canceled lunch dates until things blew over. An ad hoc committee from a client's association requested documentation. I sat across from my manager in a room with 2 bright lights and watched her face as she tried to mask her professional concern with something like empathy. "This will be handled," she said. "We will issue a statement about recusal and professionalism. We need to keep the integrity of our work unquestioned." "I didn't leak anything," I said. The words sounded like defense in a court I had not chosen. "I know," she replied, and the pause that followed said everything. Truth is no protection from suspicion when your life becomes a headline. The legal wheels turned with the slowness of glaciers and the inevitability of law. Julian's firm placed him on leave. The charity paused its events. An internal investigation into his conduct began, and with it came the machinery of audit. Emails summoned, calendars pried open, excuses reduced to timestamps. The lover's reputation, once polished and impenetrable, took on the color of tarnish. Where he had enjoyed privileges, he now found margins, clauses, and committees. But justice, the neat moral currency my mind had once loved, proved less commodified than I'd imagined. The first hearing revealed the complexities I had skirted in my fantasies. Julian's attorneys argued privacy. His defenders, colleagues who had benefited from his charm, spoke in carefully stage-managed statements about the dangers of rumor. Claire, when asked for a comment by a man whose microphone smelled of cheap cologne, said only, "I am sorry for any hurt." It was not an admission. It was humanity trudging under accusation. The most brutal blow came not from press or policy, but from the family of a man Julian had worked with, a man whose death had been touched by substandard oversight at his firm years prior. The connection was salt in an old wound. The affair, once an intimate matter, became a prism through which every failing might be judged. My orchestrations had given others an opportunity they might have exploited, and with that realization came nausea. There were nights when I sat in the lab and watched the centrifuge spin like a planet that could not change course. A junior analyst confided, half whispering, that clients had been asking whether any of our cases were compromised by association. The word compromised tasted like betrayal. It was also, I realized with a slow, awful clarity, accurate. My name on the chain of custody had infected the sanctity of other people's truths. I had weaponized the thing that made my work sacred. The ethics board called for a review. They wanted to know, in the clean, blank way institutions demand, whether my personal involvement had contaminated outcomes. My employer could lose clients, my colleagues their careers. Claire and I met less and more these weeks, less as lovers, more as litigants in a case neither of us could fully explain. We sat with lawyers in sterile rooms and marched through depositions that made my stomach fold in on itself. She told her story, incomplete, messy, human, in ways I had never asked her to. Tears fell in measured places. She gave answers that opened as many questions as they closed. I listened the way an investigator listens to a witness, attentive, cataloging, recording. At home, she left a post-it on the refrigerator with grocery items and a scribble. "Remember, your mother calls Sunday." Smallness, domesticity that resisted the headlines. One afternoon, I found a letter slipped under my office door. No return address. Inside, a single sheet with precise handwriting read, "People will judge you. Some will thank you. Most will forget you. What matters is who you are when the noise dies." The anonymity of it felt oddly intimate, a note from a stranger who had watched the same collapse and chosen not to clap. "You did this for me?" Claire asked one night, voice small, as if asking whether I had performed an unthinkable kindness or an unpardonable cruelty. The question articulated the fault line between us. "I thought I was doing it for both of us," I said. The honesty there felt like an open fracture. We began to see the true cost. Julian's partner filed a claim alleging reputational damage that might translate into monetary loss. Clients demanded hearings. Donors whispered about rescinding gifts. The charity's biggest benefactor withdrew funding temporarily, an action that threatened jobs at an organization I had once admired. With every domino that fell, a part of me recognized the sound of things I could not fix. There were physical consequences I had not anticipated. Julian, already under the microscope, suffered a panic attack in a hallway outside the boardroom, a clumsiness in a man who had always been in control. He went to the hospital for observation. When I visited, it felt surreal. Fluorescent lights, clipped nurses, the smell of antiseptic. He looked smaller there, his suit replaced by a hospital gown that betrayed a human frailty I had never presumed to imagine. For an instant, I felt nonsense, a potent mix of triumph and sympathy that made me dizzy. "You could stop this," he said to me, voice a rasp. "And then what?" I answered. The question was honest. "Live with what you did, pretend nothing mattered." He laughed once, a sound that was not mocking but raw. "You've made them look," he said. "You've made them see. Is that enough for you?" His words landed and did not answer me. Friends began to fall silent in my presence, or they would speak in the clipped tones people used when speaking about dangerous weather. Behind their eyes, I saw calculations, association, risk, the human need to avoid picking sides in a fight that could burn them. My work became a liability I had never anticipated. Audits were demanded. A senior partner asked me to take a leave while the review proceeded. The request was gentle and brutal. It was mercy as removal. One night, living in a hotel room my firm had secured, temporarily, I watched footage of a talk show host reading an old interview of ours, the audio clipped and reoriented until my words sounded like arrogance. People chimed in online, some vicious, some pitying. The internet had turned into a tribunal and a carnival simultaneously. The feedback loop was merciless. And yet, even in the furious noise, there were moments of strange clarity. In a deposition, Claire said something that made the rest of us, lawyers, court reporters, myself, stop. "I am not an actress," she said. "I am a woman who loved and then did something I am ashamed of. I do not deserve to have my life chosen for me by people who only know my worst moments." The room quieted. There was a truth in that sentence that refused to be neatly categorized. It was not absolution. It was not an apology that would stitch what had been torn. But it was human and adamant, and for a moment the machinery of ruin paused. I found myself, in those pauses, wondering less about spectacle and more about consequence. The legal system, once a tool, had become an actor with its own rhythms and mercies. Atlantic swings of public opinion morphed quickly. Law moved slower, more deliberate, with room for mitigation and negotiation. I watched advisors and attorneys argue not for punishment, but for resolution. They talked of settlements, confidentiality agreements, public statements crafted to limit damage. The machinery responded with pragmatism that pleased nobody completely. And beneath all of this was a quieter reckoning, an interior trial no court could adjudicate. I cataloged my motives like evidence. Betrayal, yes. Pride, yes. A sense of having had years stolen, yes. Also anger at myself for having let silence be a substitute for intimacy, for not asking the questions that might have altered outcomes. The ledger of my own failures grew, a file I could not serve on another. One evening, when the rain had stopped and the city smelled like something cleansed but raw, Claire came to my temporary room and handed me an envelope. Inside was a photograph I had never seen, us at a cheap roadside diner in another life, messy hair, laughing at a joke I had forgotten. On the back she had written in a looping hand, "For when you forget who we were." "I want you to remember," she said, "not because it wipes away what happened, but because it's still true." I folded the photograph carefully and put it on the nightstand. The image felt like contraband. I looked at her then and saw the strain in her eyes, a woman marked by shame and also by a remarkable steadiness I had not expected. In that steadiness lived an invitation and a dare, to choose not only between vengeance and legal remedy, but between vengeance and mercy. The legal cases would grind on. The audit would continue. Friends would make their choices and clients their calculations. But the more public things unraveled, the more I realized that the most intimate reckoning was still private. Could I live with the architecture I'd built? Could I stand in a room and admit that I'd used my craft not merely to reveal truth, but to wield it as a weapon? When I left Claire that night, rain began again in thin threads. I walked slow, each footstep deliberate, each breath a small negotiation. The photograph lay like a talisman on my nightstand, and perhaps it was the only thing keeping me from becoming someone I would not recognize in the mirror. There was no neat satisfaction in watching the fall of others. There was a hollow, a small space that no headline could fill. I had watched reputations fold and heard the echo of my own name in conversations that were not meant for me. I had orchestrated consequences and saw, in the bodies and ledgers and hospital rooms, the human cost. At the edge of this chapter, the choice returned like a tide. The law would do its part, the public would have its say. But inside my chest, in a place the reporters could not reach, I was still Censor, the man who had once promised not to make himself small for another. The question was not whether I could destroy them. I had already set that machinery in motion. The question was whether, when the dust settled, the man left standing would be someone I could live with. I thought about the anonymous note again. What matters is who you are when the noise dies. The sound of it returned like a benediction and a threat. The final reckoning might not be legal at all. It might be a moral ledger only I could balance. Outside, the city kept its indifference spinning. Inside, my hands trembled not with the thrill of victory, but with the fatigue of consequence. The photograph glowed in the low light like a small, unstable proof that we had been more than our worst moments. Between two breaths, a choice tightened like a fist. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and shining beneath a hesitant dawn. I stood by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I hadn't touched in hours. The storm of the past weeks, the evidence, the messages, the exposures, the slow erosion of reputation, had run its course. The machinery I had orchestrated had executed itself perfectly, every lever pulled, every consequence measured. Julian's firm was reeling, Claire had been humiliated, and yet. The triumph tasted hollow, almost antiseptic. I had imagined this moment for weeks. The dramatic unveiling, the shattering of their carefully constructed lives, the satisfaction of justice rendered with precision. But as I watched the sun rise over buildings glinting like glass teeth, I realized revenge had never been enough. I had achieved everything I could desire professionally, legally, and strategically. But emotionally, I was still tethered to something far more fragile. The life I thought I had shared with Claire, the love that had once been ordinary and unspectacular, yet absolute. Her knock on the door was soft, hesitant. I didn't need to ask who it was. She stepped in with the same careful grace that had marked our best years, carrying nothing but herself, a small bag and the weight of weeks, worth of shame and fear. "George," she began, her voice trembling in the empty apartment. "I know what you did. I know what you've made happen. And I don't know if I can ever explain why I—" "You don't have to," I interrupted, though the words felt clumsy in my throat. "I don't want excuses. I have the proof. I've seen everything." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Then why aren't you yelling? Why aren't you furious?" I didn't answer immediately. I watched her, really watched her, the lines of stress etched into her face, the slight slump of her shoulders, the haunted gleam in her eyes. She was still beautiful, painfully human, and the realization struck me like cold water. I had planned to make them suffer, to orchestrate the ultimate downfall, and yet what I wanted now was not to watch her burn, but to see if anything of us could remain intact. "Because I'm done being the instrument," I said finally. "I've played my part in the machinery of ruin, and I've learned something, in the quiet after everything fell, that destroying someone doesn't heal the hole in your own chest." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment the weight of our shared history, the birthdays, the arguments, the whispered secrets, pressed between us. I remembered the first time she had laughed at one of my clumsy jokes, how I had felt the world tilt just for me. I remembered holding her hand through long nights and thinking that no matter the chaos outside, we could make our own orbit. "I don't know if I deserve this, or you," she whispered. "You don't get to decide that," I said. "Neither of us does, but I can decide who I want to be after the storm. And I want to be someone who can still feel, who can still forgive, not because it erases what happened, but because I need to reclaim myself from the bitterness I almost let consume me." She took a tentative step closer, and I felt the weight of months of rage and sorrow lift slightly. Forgiveness was not absolution, and it was not a promise that things would return to the way they were. It was a decision, a choice to let go of being a prisoner to betrayal, a choice to reclaim dignity in the aftermath. We stood in silence for long moments, the city humming beneath us, two fragile humans dangling between the wreckage of what had been and the uncertainty of what might come. And then she reached for my hand, a slow, careful bridge across months of mistrust, and I let her. "Can we start again?" she asked, voice barely audible. I squeezed her hand. "We start by being honest, by living without lies. That's all I can promise right now." Outside, the sun rose higher, washing the city in gold. The storm was over. Julian's empire of lies was crumbling. The world had witnessed the truth, and yet the real victory was quieter. I had survived the storm of my own fury and emerged with the capacity to choose, to forgive, to rebuild, to reclaim the life I had deferred for revenge. We didn't know what the future held. Perhaps the bitterness of the past would never fully leave us. Perhaps there would be scars, reminders etched in memory and in our bodies. But standing together, hands intertwined, I felt a fragile hope take root. I had wielded my expertise like a weapon, yes. I had orchestrated ruin with precision. But at the end, the ultimate truth remained. Revenge could destroy others, but forgiveness was the only thing that could restore me. And in that moment, I realized that the choice I had delayed for so long, the choice between annihilation and mercy, had been mine all along. We stepped outside together, into the pale morning light, carrying the evidence of everything that had happened, and choosing, for the first time in weeks, to live beyond it. The end.